Oh, hi everyone, and welcome to the Pain-Free Athlete Roundtable. And I love doing these kinds of things because of the fact that it gives us a chance to really get into topics that mean something to everyone. And so this one this month is on women's health and performance and breaking barriers in sports. Um, I have gathered an incredible group of women who are redefining what's possible in athletics, health, and leadership. And I'm just so happy that you're all here.
Thanks
So,
for
welcome,
having us.
everyone.
Thanks for having us, Dana.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to start off with a quick introduction. So, share your name, your role, and finish this sentence. Breaking barriers means. So, I'm going to pick the first one, and then you're going to have to fight for who goes next. All right. So, we're going to start off with Dr. Abby.
Hi guys, I'm Dr. Abby DeBruin. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I did a fellowship in sports medicine, so that's kind of my current role of helping injured athletes get back to the things that they want to be able to do. I would say to me, breaking barriers means getting more women, into fields that have historically been male dominated, and so that's something that we're working on hard in orthopedic surgery.
Fantastic.
I'll go next. I'm Alex Larson. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm also a mom. I have 3 little kids. And when I have a little bit of spare time, I like to also be an athlete. So I just recently, in the past year, started getting into gravel cycling. Before kids, was into triathlons. And so love women in sports and also having that dual role of, being a parent and having a career and doing it all. So for me, breaking barriers from a dietitian standpoint is fueling your body instead of fighting it.
Ooh.
Love that. My name's Katie Armstrong. I'm a women's hormone health and longevity coach, also an athlete. I've been a competitive triathlete, yogi, and multi-sport athlete for decades now. And for me, breaking barriers when it comes to women's sports really is inviting us to look at the long game and recognize that so infrequently are women being studied appropriately. And so much of the advice we've been given is with this assumption that women are small men and we are not. So if we're going to break barriers, I'd really encourage it to include us in science and acknowledge that we are cyclical beings and that if we want to be athletes for the long haul, we need to be thinking about our bodies in a different way than we have been.
That's great. So just to loosen it up a little bit, like what's one word that describes being a woman in sports today? And we'll start off with you, Katie.
Oh, opportunity, excitement. I'm thrilled with what I'm seeing in women's sports right now.
Anybody else?
I'll add powerful. I just love how strong women are showcasing themselves both personally and professionally.
Great.
Yeah, I think mine would be tenacity. So I think you kind of see women that are breaking barriers in sport, and you just see all of them share in common this kind of attitude of this kind of like ferocious, attitude towards success and towards what they're doing. And so again, we like to see that professionally for women and then in sport as well.
I love it. For me, there's just I don't even know how to describe it because there is this excitement, and as well, there's just this piece where it's evolving, and I love to watch it evolve in front of us. Just in my lifetime, especially, of course, everybody knows about the women's soccer team, and just, they're going from wearing men's jerseys and getting paid, pittance, or actually taking a loss playing on the national team, to actually receiving um, close to equitable pay, getting sponsorships, all that kind of stuff, and just watching athletes being recognized. And of course, that's going to start happening in the WNBA because of the following that they're receiving too. And I just, we want to not necessarily highlight the financial piece because we want to obviously be recognized for our skill, but in our society, how you show up and how you get compensated is definitely how the world recognizes you. So yeah, so I think that's pretty cool. So I want to kind of move along and get to like talking about our bodies, because that's what definitely makes us different. And women's physiology has, as you talked about, Katie, like unique rhythms and needs, and a lot of the training programs and even the science kind of ignore that. And I would love to hear your, any of your thoughts on um, how do hormone cycles and pregnancy and menopause impact our recovery, and what is one thing that you hope that coaches understood about women's bodies?
Is that directed towards me, Dana?
You're talking first, you win.
Okay. Well, as a female athlete, I look back and realize that I had predominantly male coaches, and our menstrual cycles were not discussed, and our programming was certainly not in any way in response to where we were in our cycle. And I remember having one of my first meets where I was actually bleeding be one of my worst meets. And I remember getting a lot of pushback from my family, from my coaches, like, what's wrong? And one, not feeling comfortable to even mention that I was bleeding. Second, not having any idea that that might be having an impact. And it took, honestly, decades for me to realize that if I was at least tracking and cognizant of my cycle, that I could choose which races to do based on what was, fortunately for me, a consistent cycle. But that now, as a hormone coach, I recognize that while a professional athlete may not be able to choose when they're competing, they can certainly change their training, rest, and fueling plan based on where they are in their cycle. And I predominantly work with women over 35. So I'm working with women as their cycles are starting to be irregular or starting to change. And I'm not even finding very many people in the medical field who understand that women are now in that phase going to need dramatically different programming for their fitness, nutrition for their fueling, and recovery. And so it's a much broader conversation. I want to know exactly what you're interested in, but suffice it to say that tracking, if people can start tracking their cycle, if women can start paying attention to what their rhythms are, what their needs are, and acknowledge that every body is different, but that it's likely that their needs map out onto their cycle, at least to an extent, and that they then need to figure out what their goals and priorities are for their body, because mapping sort of what's actually happening and what they're hoping to accomplish in their life can bring about a lot of strategy. And I don't like to think of women as complicated, but we are organic and there is a lot that's going on in our systems. And so the more we can learn, the more wise we can be in how we choose to act and work with our bodies.
That's great.
That's excellent, Katie. I think to kind of piggyback off of what she brought up, from my side of things, mostly seeing people when they're in a more injured state. There's so much that hormone cycles kind of have to do with that. And like you said, kind of some of the science and literature, although there's been, gains in starting to study these things, I think we haven't gotten to the point of taking that knowledge and then translating it to what should you do? What's a appropriate program? I think we're lagging behind in that stance. So, again, kind of the low hanging fruit for me as an orthopedic surgeon is ACL tears, right? So we know women have a 4 to 6 times higher rate of ACL tears than, matched counterpart males in similar sport. And we know that hormone cycles are one thing that play into that, as well as, other anatomic factors, neuromuscular factors. That we know that hormones and our hormone cycles have a really big role in this, right? So the ACL itself, fibroblasts within the ACL have estrogen receptors. And we know that some of these hormones, estrogen, relaxin, that women cycle through. And I mean, pregnancy is like a whole nother beast with that. But we know that those hormones can definitely make somebody more susceptible to injury. And we have some literature that, kind of talks about OCPs potentially being, somewhat protective to knee stability, but yet we haven't kind of made any final steps on like actually talking about this, a little bit more openly. Of course, decisions on what you want to do, with regulation of your cycles on top of tracking is totally, a very personal decision with lots of factors that go into it. So we would never want to, I guess, make anyone feel like they had to do a certain thing. But I think at least to have that information available and let people kind of use some of that information that might end up being protective for them. I think that's kind of maybe the next step, is that right now there haven't been as many women that are, talking about that. And so it's a little bit of a like buried lead, if you will, right? We know the risk is there, but people aren't really talking about what should we do from an injury prevention standpoint, or, if you're interested in that. And then, the same thing goes like, menopausal women, that hormone slew changes your body's ability to, heal from certain things. So recovery is different. I had a patient in my office the other day asking me if Achilles tendonitis could be tied to her perimenopausal symptoms. And I thought for a second, honestly, I don't know. That's not something I talked about in my training or learned about. And then when I looked into it, I was like, yes,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely. So there's just a lot that, like you mentioned, we're lagging a little bit behind in. And I think we're starting to see some of this literature, but then we're just not maybe necessarily kind of getting to that next step in what do we do with it?
Yeah.
I'll just
Go ahead,
well,
Alex.
can I come in from like a nutrition standpoint?
Yeah.
I find from my experience, and I work pretty much exclusively with endurance athletes, so a lot of runners, triathletes, cyclists, and so more longer distance, longer hours, and a lot of that training is very stressful on your body. And when especially female athletes are under fueling, feeling like they still need to restrict in order to fit into a certain like leanness mold that is typically seen in more of those endurance sports, that's where hormones actually can really get deregulated. And so for me, what I see is if we can really optimize nutrition and recovery, put your body into a much happier state, we're seeing our cycles are more regular, their hormones are more regulated, and the body is overall just happier. We're preventing injuries, so they're not having to go visit Dr. Abby. And like to me, I feel like it's all kind of connected, right? Like the training and recovery and the hormones and whatever stage of life you're in, as long as you're fueling well and you're taking care of your body, I think you're going to be set up much better for success, regardless of if you're a professional athlete or even if you're just doing this as your hobby.
And Dana, if you're open to some more specific information on this, I mean, I work with women on like teaching them how to create programs for themselves, respond to like programs that they're getting that are more generic, and how to map these on to their cycles. And so, I like to simplify this for people, but most people don't know this, but the first day you bleed, you consider that the first day of your cycle. And what I like to remind people is it's almost like an arc. And you can kind of, with up until the point of ovulation, like is a really solid arc of being able to like train harder, work harder, tolerate more physiological stress. As we get towards our menstrual cycle, that's where we need to start being a little bit more cautious, with one exception. During the few days of ovulation, you do have more risk of injury, even though you feel really energetic and powerful. And so as you start learning that pattern, you can kind of see why women are going to benefit from acknowledging this pattern, because there really ends up being these like isolated windows where you would really want to effort and push. And that's pretty different than a man, where instead of just it being one of these things where like, let's escalate, let's keep going week after week, harder after harder, it allows you to map on kind of your deload weeks or your rest weeks, or to acknowledge when you should be doing more tempo versus power. So just to say that, like, there is some information out there, like, I studied Stacy Sims' work. I found her to be really, really just a frontiers woman in this space. And I just think that, again, even knowing these maps, if women can sort of track their own experiences, like what their recovery is, and mapping that onto their schedule, like looking at how a certain workout is feeling in their body, and then just to map that onto women long term, perimenopause is extremely high fluctuations and back and forth of hormones. And so you cease to be able to think of it as this like monthly cycle, and rather it is almost like you educated yourself through your consistent cycle of how you respond when you feel a certain way. And so then when you hit perimenopause and things are all over the map, it starts to be, how do I feel? How does that relate to how I used to recover on a certain day that I felt a certain way? And I found that that can then be like the way that women come back into a place of understanding about what their needs are.
Yeah.
So if that's useful, I just thought I'd throw that out there as more specifics for people.
Well, and I think of myself in two different locations. It's like, as a college athlete, I don't know if I really had any choice of how my scheduling was going to be and what my workouts were going to look like, because the coach made the determination, and we had games and we had schedules and there was travel. So it was kind of like, you just have to kind of fight through it. And if you felt like crap, it didn't matter, because you had to show up, because that was part of your job, right? As this college athlete. And so, and I think there's a challenge in that. I mean, the cool thing is that eventually, when a group of females start hanging out together, eventually they all get on the same kind of
Yeah.
cycle. So it would make it easier for a coach to go ahead and figure that out. And then perimenopausal Dana was a nightmare, because I was so depleted and nutritionally messed up, because there was things that I was craving, and then there's things that I didn't want, and my protein was not where it needed to be, and I was having a hard time hydrating. And then of course my cycle was all over the place, and I was training for a triathlon, and there would be weeks where I couldn't go into the pool because I didn't want to be, 13-year-old Dana, like having an accident in the pool kind of stuff, or that I was really literally having such a heavy cycle that I had zero energy and could barely make it across,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things. And I feel like we're almost like a puzzle a lot of times, right? Because of course we have things that we're in common because we're females, but then there's also that piece of everybody's different,
Yeah.
and everybody's body types are different. And like Alex said, there's some weird stuff that gets kind of thrown out. So if you're a person in a specific sport, you need to have a certain looking body type, or so you think. So then nutritionally, you're messing with yourself, because you're like, well, everybody else on the team looks like this, and I need to look like that. And I think there's a lot of things. But I think what I'm looking at is, like, now that this information is out here, like Dr. Abby, you were talking about the fact that you were not considering the Achilles tendonitis, which is kind of funny, because I've noticed that my left Achilles has been kind of barking at me, and I'm like, where did this come? Like, total random ass pains that start happening when you're in that perimenopause menopause thing. And a lot of it is inflammation, which, again, factors into diet and, how you feel your body. But have you personally changed how you're training females, because of this information, and now that it's become more, I guess, mainstream? And I'll go ahead and start with Alex on that one. Have you changed your own training? Have you changed training for your clients as a result of the information?
I'll be honest, I haven't, because to me, like a lot of the athletes that I work with also have families, they also have careers. And so for us, it's more of like, okay, let's find a nice routine that works for them consistently.
Hmm.
But also listening to your body, and it's like, okay, what is it telling us? Are we struggling with energy levels? Are we struggling with hunger levels? Like, how can we optimize nutrition that way, and building a nice routine, a lot of their skills and strategies and tools for them to support themselves physically in their training? Because I find that training is very periodized. Like, there's, especially for endurance athletes, there's your in season, there's your preseason, there's off season. Like, how can we shift nutrition to align with that? And in terms of like fueling for around your cycle, while there is like some newer research that's come out on that, I find that honestly still building that nice foundation with just getting enough protein, timing out your carbs well around your workouts, and eating lots of fruits and vegetables and getting lots of micronutrients through those, like those basics, I feel like can get you 98% of the way, instead of trying to refine, like, oh, do I eat more carbs in my luteal phase or my follicular phase? Like, that gets too complicated. And for me, I'm like, let's keep it simple and build a nice routine for athletes and support them best that way.
That's good. Dr. Abby?
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, right now, with me, mostly seeing people when they come in to see me injured, a little bit less so. But aside from providing education to women, because a lot of times these injuries are things where there's risk of re-injury or injuring the other side or things like that. So, kind of trying to provide information at that time. I think the kind of what we call the female athlete triad, or there's different names that are in literature now. That's something that when I work with any teams, during my training, I spent a lot of time, as a team physician. I'm working on kind of getting involved in that now as I'm kind of starting my practice. But I think that's an area where there's potential for growth, and to improve essentially education around, and trying to be a resource for some female athletes, in order to just at least provide the information so that they can kind of make informed decisions for themselves, around those things. Because like you said, a lot of like our college athletes, they don't necessarily have a ton of choice about when their game days might fall. But I try to at least provide information around, like we talked about, some of the highest risk, points in a cycle, different things like that. And of course, if we notice any, early signs of like female athlete triad symptoms and low energy availability, that's something that we try to be involved in early, as opposed to later, when somebody has a potentially devastating injury like certain stress fractures, that I'm sure you guys have had experience with in some of the high endurance and high level runners.
Katie?
So I absolutely work with educating people on how to alter their food, their movement based on their cycles, but also I'm working with a lot of women that are postpartum, a lot of perimenopausal and menopausal women. So in that respect, we're looking at the cycle that they are in, as opposed to necessarily the menstrual cycle specifically. But I think Alex is right. I mean, eating a well-balanced, sufficiently fueled, like, nutrition profile is essentially 98% of the way. But a lot of people come to me in dysfunction. And so what we're trying to do is initially educate them on what that looks like. But when I do have athletes who have been high caliber athletes and who are now in a space of dysfunction, or I'm in a position where I'm trying to support somebody where everything has gone so off the rails that every little bit helps, we're trying to find those low hanging fruit recommendations. And so if somebody is menstruating, reminding them that during high hormone phases, they need more calories, that's a really good piece of advice. To say, oh, I'm bloated right now, that doesn't mean I should diet. That means I need to fuel my body. It's counterintuitive if somebody is thinking about aesthetics or worried about putting on a few extra pounds. What they don't realize is they're actually creating more risk and more dysfunction by not fueling that high hormone phase. But in menopause and the lead up to it, I see perimenopause as the warning of what's coming, and you really do have to acknowledge that the body functions in a totally different way. And what I'm seeing are women who have been able to do high endurance athletics, high intensity athletics, and all of a sudden they can't get out of bed. They can't function and go to work. So it's less about trying to fit their programming into their responsibilities and trying to keep them functioning so that they can maintain their responsibilities. And at that point, I'm having very hard conversations with lifetime endurance athletes and encouraging them to put on muscle, and that means that they're going to have to go in the gym and lift heavy weights. And that is as much a mental game as it is a physical game. And I was one of those people. I mean, I was 10 workouts a week, in the pool multiple times a day, on the bike for 5-6 hours at a time. So it was a huge shift to recognize that my new challenge was, how do I get as much meat on this body as possible? But I will tell you that in the second phase of a woman's life, in a way, the more muscle they have on their body and the more iron they're willing to lift, the better they're going to feel, the more energy they're going to have to maintain the things that they love. So I like to say, build the muscle, use the muscle. So, if you're too lean and you find yourself in a place of dysfunction, hit the gym as hard as you can, put on as much muscle as you can, fuel that muscle with sufficient protein, And then your body may be able to return to the stress of higher levels of cardio or intensity because you won't see it as stress. So I'm absolutely talking with women about like how to fit these things into their short cycles and their lifetime cycles. But that's because they're coming to me like desperate for improvements.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel the
I think
desperation too.
I think that's such a good point, Katie, that you brought up though about like weight bearing activity and weightlifting, because we know that women already are starting to lose bone mass from age 30 on, right? So like probably all of us are already sadly in the
Man,
phase
that's
where
younger
like
than I thought.
our you know, peak bone mass or peak bone density has already passed, and now, you know, we're in the stage of like trying to maintain as much as possible. And so I talk to a lot of my patients about this because unfortunately I see people who have had a fracture, and so then, you know, we're talking about like what can you do to maintain this, and the literature definitely shows that weight bearing, you know, loading is what helps maintain bone health as well. So I think the points that you were making also, you know, has another great injury prevention factor. And so sometimes people are good at lower extremity weight bearing type things because certain body weight things can get some of that, and then upper extremities end up being missed, right? So then you have risk of like wrist fractures, you know, things like that. So that's another thing that, you know, I try to echo as much as I can, but sometimes I'm seeing these people once they're injured. So
yeah, and Dana, I know you wanted to bring in pregnancy at least to an extent. Like I have a 5-year-old and I had her at 40, so I'm very healthy going into my pregnancy, no issues. But coming out of it after breastfeeding for a few years, I didn't realize how much muscle mass was literally cannibalized from breastfeeding and having a baby. And that was despite working out and lifting through the whole process. And so I remind women that are, you know, aiming for fertility or going into having one or additional kids to, again, put on some mass, because if it's healthy muscle, it's going to protect your bones. It's going to protect your metabolism. It's going to protect your longevity, your risk of falling, your ability to heal from falls or any sort of injuries or illness. So I really see muscle as medicine and really strongly encourage people to be strong.
Katie, after my first, I had a very muscular butt, and then I breastfed for a year, and it like gone. Like I was like, my baby literally ate my ass. So
I'm all cannibalized. You guys are harsh.
it was worth it, but I was like, my butt is literally disappeared.
Oh, that's crazy. All right. I want to move on because aside from the physical aspect, which we could probably talk about forever, for many women, performance isn't just about the physical piece. It's also, you know, especially for college athletes, it's tied to identity and confidence. And I want to ask you all, like, how do cultural expectations, body image, or even comparison, which is a nightmare, impact mental health and performance for women? We've also had some examples. Tennis has really stood up, gymnastics with Simone Biles, and then again, tennis with Naomi Osaka, and quite a few. Coco Gauff also talked about it. So there's been a lot of people that have been brave enough, which is scary that I have to say that, because it's not like they're doing something horrible. They're actually talking about their feelings, and they're talking about their mental health and their schedules impacting them, or outside factors like crowd and social media really messing with them. But how do you all think that these really impact us, and what can we do to kind of hopefully take care of ourselves as athletes? Because, you know, the social media death scrolling is never a good thing.
I think it impacts everything. These cultural expectations. I mean, I think we could talk about it all day long. I think of the women's Tour de France this summer, and the winner of the women's Tour de France, who had just won in April, a very big race. Between April and July, she had strategically decided to get herself a little bit leaner because the Tour de France had a lot more climbing. And that was all the media could talk about. They just articles and articles talking about her weight loss and how and that was like the only thing that she did and that was worthy of her winning. Right. And and they pitted her against the second place winner. I mean, it was just maddening, where I'm like, this woman has committed her entire life to this career. She has multiple mountain bike world championship titles. Like, she's a very good cyclist. This one thing that she did was not the one factor that got her across the stage wins first. And so to me, like, that's really frustrating, is that the media that's all that they're talking about, and that's all that matters to them. And so I'm hoping that we can change that culture a little bit in the media. But also there's this societal expectation of, leaner is faster. And yes, power to weight ratio does matter, but it is not everything. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that self-image and the expectation and demand to perform well, it's a lot of pressure, and it's hard to kind of navigate that mentally. So I really have to commend Simone and all of those women for speaking up about it and normalizing it.
Dr.
Yeah,
Abby?
I would say one thing that affected me that I didn't really have a name for when I was a freshman, in college playing basketball, but then I kind of learned a name for later in my medical training is what we call imposter syndrome. So this kind of thought of like, I don't belong as much as the others, or how did I get here, and am I qualified to be doing, what all my peers are doing? It's pervasive in the medical field, and it's just something where I've kind of realized, this is something that so many women, or at least maybe they're more willing to talk about it than men in similar fields or positions, but so many women are dealing with. And it kind of goes along with what you mentioned on, expectations and just kind of the mental load of some of these things that women are dealing with. And then, I see it professionally too, especially when people are in these, professional settings that may be male dominated. And so I think, my own, like, I guess, little advice on like the things that I feel like have been helpful for me are preparation and visualization, which obviously there's a lot of kind of literature and thought about visualization in sport and performance. But, when I have like a bigger case, I'm reviewing notes, I'm watching videos, I'm going through the steps in my head to make sure that I kind of have an answer to any little thing that could go wrong, and how am I going to troubleshoot, and what am I going to do, which then allows me to have positive self-talk of reminding myself, like, I have excellent training. I'm just as well qualified as my male colleagues to do hard surgeries, and I take excellent care of my patients. And I know for a fact I'm going to, do exactly everything I can to make sure they have really good outcomes. And so the combination of the preparation and the visualization then allows you to, I think, give yourself that positive reinforcement and that positive self-talk of, I can do this, I am qualified to do this, I'm well trained, I'm ready, all of these things that you need to hear to kind of combat those feelings.
That's kind of crazy. I was going to ask you, the other piece of it is like, how much do you think the media, or why does, and this kind of goes back to what Alex was saying, is why does the media focus on female bodies? Because they don't really focus on men's bodies, I think, to the same.
Right.
They never talk about males' weight or ask them about what designer they're wearing and how they got their prep for the day. Like, it's ridiculous.
I do think that there's been maybe a little bit of positive change as certain celebrities maybe have started to challenge that a little bit, right? When they get asked, oh, what are you wearing? And they say, oh, would you ask the men that? Every once in a while in today's day and age, we see a little bit of challenge to that, which always, makes me feel good. But of course, it hasn't necessarily changed what you mentioned, which is that there's still this focus, right? So
I got to give a lot of credit to Alona Marr for her social media feed is just all about women and body positivity. And I think it's really important for women to be mindful of what their feed is showing them, and making sure that they're following accounts that bring up more positive thoughts about themselves and around their sport, and unfollow and block the accounts that they find are more toxic and kind of give them more negative thoughts. I think that we have a little bit more control of that, but you do have to be mindful about what you're liking, what you're following, and making sure that you're looking for those more positive accounts.
Yeah, the algorithms for real.
I think those are some
that kind of brings up an interesting point that I've talked about with friends, but has never really come up, in other circles before, which is, and now that there's NIL in college sports, right? We're seeing some of these higher profile male athletes getting tons of money for, potentially just
Breathing.
playing their sport versus whatever endorsements or things they might be doing. And then the women's side of that, in some respects, there's great opportunity, but then in some respects, you also see some women kind of capitalizing on that in a way that's, maybe not as much like body positivity, but maybe playing a little bit into this historic theme of, body image and the fact that that sells a little bit on social media, uh, like Livy Dunn or something like that is an example that just has a huge social media following, and that's not to take anything away from her. Obviously she's an excellent athlete, but it's just interesting how that has just opened, I guess, different doors and the different paths that you see different people taking with how they, have their social media presence and how they're taking advantage of it.
Mm. Oh, that's true. Katie?
When you first presented this question, I was reminded of how many collegiate athletes, male and female, suffer with depression and even fall prey to suicide as a result of their careers ending, because so much of an identity can be wrapped into sport. And it's tricky. I was an athlete, and looking back, very much saw myself as an athlete, defined myself that way. But I attribute some of it to major injuries that had me confront early on that this may not be my path forever, or that there were going to be, this would be taken away from me gradually over the decades of my life. And I think the invitation is to really connect with your why. Why do you do sport? Is it in the short term a performative component, a job, because that defines in a certain way, what your choices around, utilizing social media as a marketing tool or an income tool may dictate what choices you make. But my hope for people is that ultimately they're moving their bodies, feeding their bodies to connect with something more deeper than that, and that fuels a capacity to make choices that are health oriented and not just the way we look or the way we perform. But it's tricky. It's always going to be this balance between what we're able to accomplish and do right now and how that will change our life trajectory moving forward. And I just think as a society, we have a long way to go in seeing the sincere worth of women and not having it be labeled just on the way that they look or as objects of attraction. And once again, I just think that if we can really connect with individuals as multifaceted human beings with a lot to offer, and a lot of these women on here have suggested, choose what is meaningful to you. I love the strong over skinny component, right? Because it shifts it at least to something that's more health affirming than something that's more superficial. I see certain sports doing a better job at promoting long-term health over just performance. But again, if you're an athlete that's competing for a sport, this is going to require some boundaries, some conversation, some, Dana, you brought up the USA soccer team and how there's a game on a certain day. And yet that's a great example. Because of so many knee injuries showing up, they started actually looking at, what do these women need to stay in their career longer? What do they need to thrive in a broader way? And I think it just starts inviting us to have a longer view. So not just the next game and not just the next season, but an athlete's entire career, and hopefully even beyond that, and creating health as a priority and not just performance. Easier
Well,
stuff.
and one of the things I think about as you're talking about is now we have the opportunity for the babies to see. And on one aspect, right, social media, bad, right? On the other aspect, it's all, oh, now one, girls can see themselves in these athletes, which they didn't have the opportunity before, right? You had to read. I remember the first book I did, or first report I did, was probably like third grade or fourth grade, and I did it on Wilma Rudolph. And I was like, she's black. And I was just so excited to see, because if you didn't see them on TV, and of course you didn't see track and field on TV unless it was the Olympics. So for me, that was like, wow, and she ran fast and she had polio and so it was like somebody overcoming this thing. And so I found this role model. With social media now, you're getting to see different role models, and of course it's always good with the bad, right? So you have the Alona Myers and her sisters and everybody who's just talking about their bodies and being proud of how they are. And there's going to be little girls out there that are like, damn, I want to be like her, I want to play rugby, or I'm okay with my body being, maybe not having big breasts, or or being okay with my small breasts, or whatever it may be. And I think that the more Alana Myers that we have, I think that helps support these young athletes coming up, and maybe at least questioning especially when you're looking at gymnastics, or some some of the more performative sports like ice skating, or ballet, or where it's definitely about your body, and there's a lot of mental stuff, and there's a lot of games, especially when you have psycho parents that are kind of wanting more from you. But they get to see these athletes and really get a good kind of, maybe a dose of reality is probably best. My favorite right now is Caitlin Clark, because she hasn't changed. I mean, she's got a lot of money, but in terms of like her look or whatever, she's still Caitlin Clark. Like, she's not slapping on, too much. I mean, she dresses up when you're supposed to dress up, right? I'm going to an award show, whatever, but she's not faking anything or acting differently than she was as an athlete. And I think that says a lot about how young athletes can be. It's like, here's somebody who hasn't really changed, and they have a tremendous amount of money compared to a lot of the same athletes.
Dana, it's wonderful what you were saying about how kids are getting influenced by the just exposure to opportunity and variability. Because I remember seeing a retrospective on women's health when I was probably 16. And I'm still impacted by that documentary, because it reminded me how young women's sports are. And in that documentary in particular, it was, shining a light on tennis, and how early on certain tennis players were kind of pushed off the court because they didn't meet some like level of beauty. And it wasn't until this like supermodel tennis player was able to show up and like be effective on the court that they allowed women into sports. And how, it took just so many trial and error moments for women to be like allowed, because they were being judged on so many criteria that had nothing to do with their sport. But I just like to remind people that this is so new, that if it feels wonky and like it still needs to be polished, it's because we're still working out the kinks, and women have been subjugated for a long, long, long time. And so we're here, but we're still trying to figure out what we want it to be. And I think we each do that individually.
That's true. So we've talked about the mind. We've talked about the body. I want to talk about now the actual movement toward bringing women's sports to the forefront. And I guess my question to you is, what barriers are still standing for women in sports, and what have you seen or where have you seen the biggest breakthroughs? And I'll start with Dr. Abby.
Yeah, so I think, there's still barriers, of course, that face, women's sports. We talked about, USA women's soccer, and now the WNBA kind of starting to have, a little bit more of maybe their own similar, opportunity to have a moment like that. But of course, there's essentially mostly that kind of collegiate level, and then the women's professional levels are in a lot of, sports that men have had access to are still kind of gaining their traction right now. But I think, I played basketball, have an interest in basketball. So kind of seen what's happened with women's basketball and the national interest, in college hoops, and even the WNBA now that, that has kind of had some ties to Caitlin Clark and, some of this more recent interest, that has been huge. I mean, when I was growing up, I never saw a women's college basketball game on TV, never. So that was something where, like our coach took our team once to like go see a Marquette University women's game. Like we went to the Twin Cities to see Deanna Taurasi play. But those were like opportunities that were sought out, to see, kind of like you mentioned, like people like you doing it on that next stage and getting to see that. But now, young girls are getting to see WNBA games and college hoops games on their TV, so we are starting to, I think, make a little bit of progress, but of course, there's still kind of more to go to keep that momentum going.
Alex?
Well, coming from a dietitian perspective, I feel like some barriers that we still have are athletes still fearing of eating more, that they might gain weight from that. And for me, it's all about showcasing like, hey, this is how much you actually do need to be eating to support your needs. Being able to listen better to your body and what it's telling you. Like if you're starting to notice you're losing your period, maybe you're getting too thin or the stress of your training, like that's a huge red flag. And in some sports, it's kind of normalized, like, oh yeah, I haven't had my period in months. And it's just kind of part of the sport. Like, no, that should not be the normal acceptable thing. And so that's a big red flag for me. It's like, oh, that should be our top priority, is getting your health back to a point where you're getting a regular cycle. And embracing strength, embracing, leanness, but not being too lean where you're seeing injuries and health injuries. Like to me, those are the barriers that I think we're still working towards. We've come a really long way, but I think there's still progress to be made.
What's the biggest breakthrough you've seen?
I am really loving the culture in the endurance sports of embracing carbs. Like runners and cyclists are obsessed with like Nerds gummy clusters, and I'm just all here for it. And that diet culture is definitely starting to have a pretty big hate club going on there. And so I'm just loving the carbs embracing and using that as fuel, and I'm here for it, and I'm super excited to see even where the research comes in the next 10 years with nutrition and sports.
Yeah, I've noticed the gels have changed with cycling. Before it was very much like, hey, here's your sugar shot of
and there was like maybe 18 to 20 grams of carb, and now we've got 30, 40, 50 grams of carb in gel. Like it's used to be they would hardly take any carbs during their endurance sports, and now we're seeing ultra runners and cyclists to 120, 150 grams of carb per hour. I mean, it's just,
wow,
it has shifted so far. Not to say that all athletes need to be consuming that much, but for athletes that are at that really high level, they're able to perform that well because they're able to take in that much fuel.
That's fantastic. What is maybe, do you have a personal story where you broke through a barrier that you just really didn't think you were going to, or that it's something for yourself that you were just like, yay me?
For me?
Yeah, for you.
Well, I did my Ironman Wisconsin race in 2014, and I did fine in that race, but as I look back, I was completely underfueled. And so now that I'm kind of back into endurance sports, I'm going in with this mindset of like, okay, I'm going to put in the work, and I've seen a lot of progress the past year. So my story is still kind of TBD, but I'm definitely leaning in more into the fuel and listening to my body. And for me at 38, I'm probably one of the strongest I've been as an athlete in my life, which is really cool. I think age is just a number, and I love hearing about athletes who are in their 40s and 50s and still absolutely just crushing it and PRing in their events, and that's really fun.
Yeah, would we just have that lady who was, what was she, 86 or something, that did Ironman Kona?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, oh, no joke. Katie, what is one aspect where you broke a barrier?
Personally,
as an athlete?
Well, I've reinvented myself as an athlete several times. And I think that, again, with like longevity being my primary focus, I just say like it takes a lot of courage and chutzpah to be willing to like put down, your triathlete gear and like pick up a yoga mat, or like, put the yoga mat aside and like head into the gym and learn something totally new. And I think that that's one of the things that makes life exciting. But again, back to that definition of self, like leaning in and recognizing, what do I need to thrive long term? And if it's not what I've done before, being willing to be a beginner and start over and put that same level of discipline and determination and knowledge to the test.
Awesome. Dr.
And if you're all
Abby?
right with it, Dana, I just wanted to say one thing I'd love to see change is I'd like gyms to be set up a little bit better for women. I see constantly that, there aren't enough lighter weights to allow women to get started. There's not enough floor space for more free weight use that I think is beneficial for integration for the way that women tend to thrive. So that's one thing I'd love to see change.
I do have to say that I've noticed that more women are at the gym, and they're in the heavy lifting area, because obviously most gyms are made the same, where they have a cardio section, they have a machine section, whatever it is, not universal machines, but whatever the hell it is, the hoist or the whatever they got going on, and then there's the free weight section. And usually the free weight section, there's not a female to be found. And I've noticed over the last few years that there's a lot of young women. So let's hear it for the college age, high school girls that are getting out there, and they're hitting the heavy weights. Of course, they're doing a lot of butt exercises, which I have like, I'm like, dude, you got a whole other part of your body. But but they're seeping into it. But in terms of safety and actually having a space, it's weird. It's still weird because some dudes just make it weird. And, I had a situation where I was there with my daughter, and the guy's like, oh, you don't want to do that exercise because it's really not good for your elbows or whatever. And I was like, thanks. Didn't ask you, appreciate it. And then my kid's like, well, my elbow kind of hurt. I was like, shut up. That's,
They should make like a separate room for just women to feel safe in strength training. I think that would be an amazing ad for a gym.
yeah. But we've done like female gyms, right? And they've totally died. And I don't know, because I can't remember what it was back in the 80s. There was a couple of different gyms
Like
that were,
curves or
yeah, they were
yeah.
all female only, and they just didn't last. But also they had an
Well,
agenda.
my mother had an all women's fitness center, actually. Like she was pretty early on and they were doing really well, but they got snuffed out by the big corporate gyms.
Right.
So it was really a money thing. They couldn't compete with the Crunches and
Yeah.
giant companies.
Yeah, which is kind of a bummer. So we're kind of getting close on time. And so I want to just ask you, and we'll start off with Katie. What is one piece of advice you would have given to your younger athlete self, or to any little young athlete that may be listening?
I mean, you're hearing a theme in what I'm putting out there, but I think muscle is medicine and I would protect it. And from the perspective of longevity, but from the perspective of injury prevention, I just think assuring that athletes have a part of their year that they are building, and for triathletes, it's often preseason, and just thinking about whether you're maintaining sufficient muscle mass to get you through your 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and allowing that to be on people's minds as early as 15, and to recognize that muscle needs to not just be like meat that you've put on, but muscle needs to be something you know how to use. So mobility, warming up and cooling down, and recognizing that there is a lot to go into proper recovery that isn't just your training. And so recognize that becoming a healthy human is going to allow you to be an athlete for longer. So if it's something you truly love, to think about the long haul.
Okay. Dr. Abby, what advice would you give little baby Abby?
I think for me, just to soak in that chance and opportunity to compete. Basketball was kind of, my passion. when I was younger. And that's like a sport that, in my opinion, is just kind of special in that just kind of fierce competitive energy. And as much as I, continue to find new passions, that I enjoy doing now, that kind of golden window in college where you just got to like leave everything out on the court. After college, for a lot of us, that's kind of your last chance to do that in some of those kind of team-based sports. So just to kind of soak in those competitive moments and the time with your teammates, I think.
That's cool. Alex, what about little Alex? What would you tell her?
Well, hindsight's 2020. So as I look back on the 8 years that I kind of took off from sports to grow my family, and always wondering like, oh, am I gonna be able to come back to sport and do that? I think to my younger self, and then to other women who maybe are in a time where life is really challenging, it's okay to take a break. You can always come back to sport, or you could just shift to, I'm just going to maintain the status I'm in right now, and I'm going to work on growing and shooting for that PR or that Boston qualifier time, in the future sometime. Like there's no deadline, but just moving with the ebbs and flows of your life and being flexible, I think is really important.
That's awesome. I think little Dana would like to know that, like, it's okay to freaking have emotions.
Oh, yes.
Right? Is that, if you're sad, be sad. Don't let people talk you out of whatever you're feeling. Experience the feelings because it's
They're
healthy.
valid. Yeah.
And they're valid. And I think I didn't know that as a kid, and so I stuffed a lot. And as people who've listened to me before know, that led to a chunk of time suffering from migraines and whatever. But I was so damn serious, and I felt like there was this persona that I had to behave a certain way. And so I would say, let that shit go. Like, if you're frustrated, be frustrated, and then learn how to communicate that so that you can make some changes instead of just bottling it up and feeling like there's nobody else to talk to, because you're not alone, right? Is the biggest piece. Anyway, all right, ladies, thank you so much for joining. I'm going to start off with you, Alex. What is a way that people can get in touch with you? We're going to put it in the notes too, but how do we work with you if we want to work with you?
Yeah, my website is alexlarsonnutrition.com. I'm also on Instagram and social media at Alex Larson Nutrition. And then I also have a podcast called Endurance Eats, where it's all on endurance nutrition.
Fantastic. Katie, how about you? How do we get in touch with you?
You can find me at inspiredliving.coach, or Instagram is Katie Armstrong Fitness.
Great. And Dr. Abby?
I guess I didn't put a ton of thought into this question. I mean, just our website, OSMS Green Bay. You can always contact through the clinic. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me for anything that's needed.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us. This was really nice.
Awesome.
And I would say it was so nice for me to kind of get